That day, Clara realized her life no longer belonged to her, and there was no way back. The telegram had arrived folded like a small accusation, its thin paper crisp beneath the lamp's weak halo. Clara read it twice because words had a way of meaning less when grief crowded around them, first as a fact, then as a verdict. Leon was dead. The line that followed was not consolation, it was instruction. Arrangements must be made for the children. 3 days. Travel west. Protect the family's interest. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke and boiled stew, the ordinary smells of a life that had just been stripped of its shape. Her mother's hands were steady as she refolded the telegram, as if order could be restored by neatness. Her father stood too straight, the look in his eyes like a ledger being balanced. Her brothers spoke in the blunt economy of men who saw marriage as a trade and a solution. Clara listened, small and astonished, while grief kept her mouth thick. Grief was something that should have been private, an interior storm. What arrived instead was a clean public decision made at the kitchen table. "You must go, Clara," her father said. "It's Leon's children. They need someone. The family needs protection. Aderet Crowley has the money. He won't let the mine fall into questionable hands. It's the right thing." Clara's hands tightened around the cup. The china rim bit into her palm like truth. She had buried Leon that morning, wrapped in linen and muffled by the winter air, and in the hours between the grave and the family's plan, Clara had imagined, foolishly, that sorrow would be enough reason to stay, that the town, the family, the children might see her grief and let her remain close to whatever remained of Leon. Instead, grief became the reason they decided she could be sent away as an exchange. "You'll only be there until they can," her mother began and stopped. The unspoken thing hung in the air. Until they judged her fit, until they married her off to keep the Crowley name loyal, until a replacement could stand where Leon had stood. It was not cruelty so much as calculation. A small frontier economy did not run on sentiment. Clara thought of Leon's laugh, the way she had braided the girl's hair, the small fierce pride with which she had called her children Oven and Millie, names that had belonged to the world of their house. She thought of how Leon had hidden notes in the children's pockets, how she had smoothed ruffled shirts and tucked a hand into a sleeping child's hair. Clara could not imagine stepping into that quiet intimacy, as if it were a role to wear. But she also could not imagine leaving the children to the rumor and the men who managed estates from behind big desks. 3 days. That was enough time, her family decided, to dress, to take train and coach, to present herself to a household that would not ask whether her heart had been torn. 3 days and a favor owed, and a ledger balanced. Clara's refusal would be met with patience like weather, menacing only because it would be unrelenting. She packed a suitcase by the firelight, folding shirts and the handful of dresses she owned with a care that felt ritualistic. Glasses reminded her of Leon's small hand pressed against the old cracked mirror. The mourner's shadow that night looked back, thin and resolute. The children would need someone with a steady hand. Leon's small private papers went into a separate bag. Clara could not bring herself to bury them, not when they might yet explain the tremor she had glimpsed beneath Leon's last letters. On the morning she left, snow lay in crusted flurries along the roadside, making the town look small and sealed. The stagecoach lumbered over frozen ruts, its belly cold and its seats packed with other travelers whose lives were as full of purpose as her own. There was a woman with a child who coughed between sips of tea, a merchant with a small satchel of ledger books, a young man who talked too loudly of town politics. Their voices blended into a kind of background noise that made Clara feel more alone than the wind beyond the coach windows. The road opened into a river of white pines. The coach's wheels ground against frozen earth, and small sounds, the creak of leather straps, the clack of horses' hooves, stitched the journey together in a rhythm that might have been a lullaby, if not for the way Clara's mind kept coming back to the telegram, to the ledger, to Leon's laugh. She had not yet reconciled the image of carrying 2 children into a stranger's home with the idea of a life she might build for herself. Instead of answers, the road gave her questions and a narrow, hard feeling of being moved. It was the hour when the light thinned and the sky went hard that the ambush happened. Men appeared like a bad weather front, sudden, angled shapes against the trees, faces mossed with scarves. The coach jolted as the reins were cut. Wood cracked and the horses balked. Men leapt forward and the world narrowed to gunmetal glint, shouted orders, the staccato fear in small voices. There was no time to think. Clara's first movement was to hold the small satchel of Leon's letters to her chest like a talisman. Behind her, a child's cry sharpened into a sound that made a new kind of steel run through her. The bandits moved with the dirty certainty of men who believed fear could be bought. They demanded money and jewels and the very bodies of the horses. A hand reached for Clara's bag. The man's fingers grazed her wrist. She felt the heat of his breath like a living thing. Then a shot split the air. It was not an accusation, not a dramatic finale, just a clean, single breaking of the world's sound. A man on horseback dropped from the ridge like a dark thought made flesh and rode down with the quiet mastery of someone who had spent years becoming necessary. He rode with his hat pulled low and a rifle angled with such practiced ease, he looked as if he and his weapon were one measure. The bandits stumbled, disordered as the suddenness of resistance turned their fear inward. Clara had never seen a man move with such calm in a scene that should have been chaos. The rider's face, when she saw it close, was weathered, but not cruel. He moved among the fallen men with the care of someone stepping among sleeping dogs, decisive, controlled, uninterested in spectacle. No voice rose in boasting. He did what needed doing, and then, as if avoiding attention, he offered his hand to help her down from the coach. "Are you hurt?" he asked, a voice like gravel warmed by sunlight. She realized then that her hands were shaking noticeably. "No," she said, and the lie stuck to her lips. Leon's papers, still clutched to her chest, trembled. He nodded once and then steadied his gaze on the coach, supervising without speech. The bandits were bound by ropes, their weapons gathered. The other passengers stared as if watching the end of a story. When the rider turned back to her, he had a small dignity that clarified something inside her. He did not offer reasons or stories, only assistance, water, a steady arm, the sort of small attentions that whispered safety. "You're traveling far," he said. She should have said no, should have declared she was going no farther than the graveyard and the house where Leon had laid her head. Instead she said, "To Crowley's." His face tightened in a way that made an unbidden question hang between them. "You keep your name?" "For now." He only nodded. "Cole Mercer," he offered, as if introductions were necessary in a place where names often meant little. He did not press. He did not ask why she was going to a man's house when she had just buried her sister. He tied up a horse, adjusted a strap, and at dusk rode away. He rode like a shadow going after business, and Clara watched until his figure slipped between the trees. Afterward, the coach crawled the remaining miles to the Crowley estate. The manor rose out of the plain like a claim post. Its long white face was cold in the thin light. A line of servants met them on the steps. The air near the house tasted of pressed linen and preserved fruit. Clara felt the house itself look at her like a judge. Adoret Crowley received her with a politeness that was carved. He was a man accustomed to being obeyed and to having his decisions framed as benevolence. His handshake was small and clinical, his eyes measuring, settling on her like a surveyor marking boundaries. "You are Clara," he said, voice flat as flint. "My condolences. We will see to the children." Clara's mouth closed. The children, Oven, a boy with hair like corn silk and a mouth that trembled when he laughed, and Millie, a narrow-faced girl with eyes that seemed too serious for her years, clung to the hem of a housekeeper's skirt and watched her as if they were seeing someone who had been summoned to role-play their mother. They were wary, waiting to see what sort of replacement the house would provide. The little girl's gaze snagged on Clara and then dropped away. Oven kept his head down, fingers worrying at a tear in his sleeve. Mrs. Bell, the housekeeper, moved through formalities with a caution that wore the shape of a watchful animal. She had the look of someone accustomed to keeping secrets in well-oiled drawers. Her voice at the introduction was almost soft, the sort of voice that kept its sharper opinions folded. If there was suspicion in her eyes, it was making itself slow. The house smelled of polish and lavender. There were scores of things to do, to be fitted into new clothes, to be readied for dinner, to be made to look right beneath chandeliers that had never seen dirt. But the house's opulence was only a shell. Inside the walls was an order that did not welcome questions. Clara felt at once guest and hostage. Crowley's presence was a low pressure. He did not need to force himself upon anyone to command the room. For a week, she moved through the household's rhythms. The children tested the edges of her patience and tenderness like birds tapping at the window to see if the glass would yield. In the mornings, she read to them from the small collection of books Leon had kept on the shelf. At night, she sat awake and listened to the house creak as if it held a separate conscience. She watched Crowley at dinner, his manner, the way his hand found the stem of his glass and left it like a mark, and noticed things that she could not at first place. Certain servants' stiff backstops when his name was mentioned, the subtle absence of some bottles from the cupboard, the way the household doctor's visits ended with smiles that never reached the eyes. Once, while helping Millie find a missing ribbon beneath a chaise, Clara's fingers closed on a folded scrap of paper. It was tucked into the devil's underwear of a small sewing box, folded and frayed at the edges. She recognized Leon's cramped handwriting at once. Her heart tripped. She kept the paper hidden until night. By lamplight she opened it and found at the top of the page the slanting, hurried script of a woman who had been afraid of being heard. The entry had the immediacy of someone writing to keep her thoughts from waking. Words were spare and careful, as if anyone could be reading them at any moment. "He calls it a sickness," Leon had written, "says it will pass. The tea tastes of iron and sometimes I cannot hold my hand steady. He laughs when I ask, says I am foolish. I found a bottle behind the little drawer today. It had a small white powder in it. I burned a scrap on the hearth and the smell made the baby sick. I do not know where else to turn." Clara's stomach did not drop. It steadied into something cold and bright. She read on, each line adding weight. Leon's entries carried fear and a fierce attempt to record, like a ledger keeping tally of wrongs. There was a mention of the household's doctor, of his soft words to Leon, of the way he seemed to avoid her questions. There was mention of a name, Adoret. The name sat there like a stone. She kept the diary in her dress that night as she pretended to sleep. The words hummed in her like a bell. Leon had not been sick by accident. If the hints meant what they suggested, then a man of Crowley's reputation could be a danger not only to memory, but to life. The diary's paragraphs threaded together into a picture that forced her into a choice. To speak would be to make accusations against a man who owned the town's masthead, its bank, its charity. To speak would be to set herself as the opposite of the neat economy that had sent her west. To remain silent would mean living in a house where the rumor of murder had been written and left like a splinter. The ledger balanced itself in a way that made Clara feel small, and as if some larger mechanism had been turning her like a key. She began to notice the small controls. A locked cabinet in Crowley's study with a brass plate unmarked. The doctor's visits that always concluded with a discreet nod and a change of subject. Gideon Price's formal friendly visits that left a paper of counsel, and then took with them the way the town's legal eyes shifted. Price had the look of someone who performed civility as his trade. He smiled with the patience of a man who had never been refused. His conversation included questions about estate affairs and an offhandedness that made leavers sound like gifts. "Mrs. Crowley will need a firm hand," he observed once, as if discussing the weather. "The estate, with children, requires certain stability. You'll find your position becomes clearer the longer you stay." Clara started to understand what stability meant in that context. Obedience, quiet compliance, a refusal of questions. It meant being as replaceable as a glove, perfectly fitted, and then cast aside when worn. Leon's diary made the edges of stability look like a knife. Clara felt an old monstrous anger rise, not at the men necessarily, but at the way the house could use small people like paperweights. It was an anger that had the sharpness of grief. Protective, terrible in its focus. Mrs. Bell watched Clara with a private gravity. One afternoon, after a dinner where Crowley's comments about town affairs had dulled the edges of the conversation, Mrs. Bell found Clara by the sewing chest and lingered longer than was required to adjust a cuff. "You're good with the children," she said quietly, eyes darting toward the office door. "They need something that steadies them." Clara forced a smile that was mostly teeth. "Leon was the steady one," she said. "I only try." Mrs. Bell's mouth thinned. "You are not Leon. You are you. That might be better, for them, if you be careful." The caution in the housekeeper's voice was a glove made of velvet and iron. Clara took it as both warning and help. She had thought she would have to do everything herself. It turned out she would need allies, small as they might be, within the house. Days passed into a pattern of careful watching. Clara read the diary in secret and kept Leon's letters in a locked trunk beneath her bed. She began, without quite telling herself, to map the household, the bell schedule, the servants' routines, the way Crowley's study was more closed after dinner, the time when the doctor preferred to arrive when the sun was half down. Each small observation became a line on a map she was drawing for herself. When she found a second scrap, this one small and folded inside the lining of Leon's child's jacket, her breath caught. Leon had written a name with a trembling hand. Poison, it said in blunt, compact letters. And then, in the margin, do not trust the sugar jar. It was a small thing, the way a suggestion could change a life. The sugar jar was displayed on the sideboard like an innocuous domestic object. Clara had poured tea from that very jar that same afternoon while Crowley told a story about a mining claim. The realization settled into her chest like a stone. The house had instruments in it, ordinary objects serving a cruel utility. She kept her face a blank as she paced through her days. There were meals to take, small arguments to quell, lessons with Oven about arithmetic, evenings when Millie insisted Clara read the same story twice because it was Leon's favorite, and the girl could not help seeking the lullaby of memory. The children clung to rituals. Leon's absence was full of rituals that no one else could fully recreate. Clara did not try to create Leon. She tried instead to be present. Yet presence had its own challenges. Her nights became restless patrols of the mind. She would wake and listen for small sounds. A bottle rolling in the study, the whisper of fabric, nothing that could be pinned down as proof. She began to understand the improbable courage it would take to stand against Crowley. He had more than money, he had influence. His name was like a belt of iron around the town. Yet the diary had given her a shape to the suspicion, and shape made action possible. It was not until one dull Thursday that the first real break came. In the early afternoon, she went to see Mrs. Bell about a dress to be altered for a small memorial to Leon. The housekeeper, who had seemed to keep herself at a safe distance, lifted her eyes and asked, as if testing an edge, "Have you had any talk with the sheriff?" Clara's throat closed. "No," she said too quickly. Mrs. Bell's jaw tightened. "Keep it quiet if you intend to gather anything. Crowley has men who listen where they should not. He listens to Mr. Price, and Mr. Price listens to people who keep ledgers. There are things best spoken softly." "What do you mean?" Clara asked, though she understood. The house itself had ears. Servants who watched, men who reported. A legal world that turned on quiet bribes and favors. Mrs. Bell lifted her hand in a brief, secretive motion and then lowered it. "If you are in need of someone to fetch a doctor, bring a note. Keep his visits to the downstairs rooms. If you must speak to the sheriff, do it where his men do not report back. We have a widow out on Dalton Road who takes lodgers in need. Mrs. Dalton keeps no ledger." The housekeeper's voice was such a careful whisper, it could have been mistaken for an ordinary conversation. That evening, with the house asleep and the lamplight casting long, honest shadows, Clara sat at the dressing table and touched Leon's handwriting. The pages were small and brittle, and the ink had seeped into the fibers like a stain that would not come out. She read the passages again, this time aloud in a voice that shook but kept its syntax. "If anything happens to me, tell them. Tell someone not to trust the sugar jar," she read, and felt the words settle around her ribs like a braced hand. There was no hero to call. Cole had ridden away into the pines after the ambush, as if he avoided being tied to gratitude. She had only two options that felt like options at all: to speak and precipitate the house's notice and perhaps the children's peril, or to be silent and live under an arrangement that might mean the same as complicity. Being silent would mean leaving Leon with an unmarked death. Speaking out could doom the children to scandal and villainy they did not deserve. The ledger of the world was exact in its demands. Clara could feel it laying her in. She thought of the telegram's paper between her fingers, as if the town had been a machine that calculated where people ought to be moved. That day, the day she had received the telegram, had been the hinge. She had not known then how literal that hinge would feel. She told herself, finally, that there was a way to be both careful and forceful. She would gather evidence. She would find out what the bottle held. She would learn the doctor's movements. The house might be full of eyes, but it was also full of objects, and objects left their traces. If Crowley could hide things in plain sight, she could look for them the same way a seamstress finds a dropped stitch. Her plan was small and domestic to the point of simplicity. Watch, gather, and if the chance came, show. Paper against paper, stain against stain. A child's remembered taste turned into proof. There was no grand gesture in the idea. It was a patience that worked inch by inch. It felt to Clara like taking back the only thing that had been demanded of her, choice. She had learned by then to trust the odd, quiet people who existed at the edge of things. Mrs. Bell was one. The woman who ran the bakery 2 streets down had been kind to Leon. Clara made a point of stopping there, learning what crumbs of conversation reached the ovens. Coal was another conduit. Men who tended the fires of the town spoke differently towards the sun. She listened to them without speaking, and catalogued their ignorance like books in a shelf. On a night when the moon rested like a coin against the sky, Clara moved through the house with the silence of someone who knows she is stealing small moments from a sleeping presence. She had rehearsed this in the hours when the children were at play and the servants occupied. Now she had to be both thief and truth-seeker. She unlocked the study door with a soft click and entered the redolence of paper and leather. Crowley's desk sat like a stern altar. In its drawers he kept the little things that made his life run. Pens, receipts, the jar of sugar that Leon had once mentioned. The drawer that should have contained the jar was rigid against her fingers. Metal met wood, where a small hidden latch held a false bottom. Clara's breath condensed on the air. She forced her hands steady and moved the latch aside. There, under a packed bed of receipts and old letters, lay a small tin with a lid. It was the sort of tin that ordinary people kept on their shelves. It had belonged to the house's rituals. Clara lifted it, feeling the weight of ordinary things turn sinister. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside was a white powder, fine as dust. She did not have the tools to test it here and now, but paper could hold traces. She pressed a fingertip to the powder and then licked it, an act born as much of ceremonial defiance as evidence gathering. There was no immediate taste, only a dull metallic afterbite that made her stomach tighten. Her mind was not a medical treatise. She could not say arsenic with certainty, but something in her knew what it might be, because Leon had written it down, and the taste matched the memory of Leon's words. She closed the tin and sat with it in her lap until the house took a shape and made sense. Leon's diary, the jar, the doctor's casualness, Gideon Price's friendly visits. A lattice of meaning connected them all. At that moment, a floorboard creaked outside the door. Clara's hands moved like a woman whose body remembered preparations rather than thought. She tucked the tin into the inner pocket of her dress, wiping her fingers on a threadbare handkerchief. The study door eased open and a pair of heavy boots crossed the hall. She pressed back into shadow, heart contracting, until the boots passed by and the hallway settled. When she finally returned to bed, the tin pressed against her like a pulse. She had a thing in her pocket that could, in the right hands, unmake the house's silence. It gave her a new kind of wakefulness, a danger that was not only the house but the world outside it that would not let her unmake herself without cost. She slept in fits, and when dawn came, it found her with a plan more form than substance. Find a doctor who could test the powder in a way that would stand up under scrutiny. Find a sheriff who would not be bought. Keep the children away from places where sugar and tea were poured without supervision. She thought of Cole Mercer, of the steadiness in his voice, the way his presence had altered the course of a day. He had not been there since the ambush. His disappearance was not an insult, but a fact of the sort of man he was. Yet having seen him made the house's options look less monolithic. The world, somewhere beyond the estate's lawns, contained people who acted on principle without asking permission from ledgers. The house continued to do its small thing of being both opulent and efficient. Crowley's dinners resumed their old courses. He sat, a fixture in polished boots, quiet and sure. Reports came in from town about the mine and the way the paybooks would be balanced to suit the season. Gideon Price visited often and always left with a pamphlet and a smile. The town listened to what Crowley said. The town raised its own small voice and then folded it away. Clara moved like an animal learning to map a new territory. She would not be passive. Leon's diary had given her a reason that edged into obligation. Her life had been moved by the payroll of a family deal, but the new life she would build, if it could be called that, would be one of guarded action. She no longer belonged to herself in the way the telegram had declared, yet inside that theft of agency, she found a smaller sovereignty, the right to choose what to do with the knowledge she now carried. To be forced west was one thing, to be kept there in silence was another. The day she finally decided to act was ordinary in every way that mattered. The sun was thin, the children had been sent off to a lesson, and Mrs. Bell had left a window open to the yard to let in the clean air. Clara sat in the parlor and smoothed the hem of Leon's dress she had been mending. She felt the diary heavy in her bodice like a heartbeat. She thought of the stagecoach's sudden quiet after Cole rode off, of the way his voice had felt steady and unremarked, of the way a single shot had been all that saved them. Her resolve sharpened with the memory. She stood, walked to the front door, and as if testing both the lock and her nerve, stepped outside into the brittle air. The house yard was quiet, the staff busy at their tasks. Across the lawn, a figure stood by the stable, a man whose silhouette cut like a promise into the winter light. He looked up as she approached, and for an instant she thought it might be Cole. But it was not. It was one of the groundsmen who kept the stables in order. Still, the sight of him, the ordinary business of the place, made the world beyond the house press closer. Clara took a breath that tasted like the decision itself. She could go to the sheriff and lay the diary on a table, ask for men to take measurements, request a test. She could trust the town's justice to withstand Crowley's money, or she could wait and gather more, a smear from a cup, a corroborating letter. She could talk to Mrs. Bell and see if the housekeeper would risk speaking more plainly. The options folded in and out of each other like fan leaves. There would be danger in any choice. There was danger in silence as well. She realized this in the held minute of breath before she made the first move. Stay with Clara. The next hours will decide whether justice can be forced to live in a house bought by money. She turned back toward the house, a plan forming in the small language of necessity. She would need proof enough to hold against a man who had everything to lose. Evidence, she decided, would have to be domestic and undeniable. A powder from a jar, the doctor's records, Leon's own words pinned like a map. If she could not force the town's machinery to move, she could at least collect the pieces that made movement possible. Inside the parlor she found Millie sewing with earnest concentration, small fingers nimble on a needle. Oven sat on the rug with a wooden horse he had carved, eyes distant. Clara sat down beside them and let the diary rest hidden beneath her hand. She tucked her plan into a sentence she could speak to a child. They would be careful, they would remember, they would not let the house take everything. The children's faces held the strange old sorrow of kids who had already been taught to measure their days in absences. At dusk, when the house settled and two small bodies were heavy with sleep, Clara crept to the study once more. Her lantern threw a small warm circle against the wood. She unlocked the drawer, and the tin of powder lay there like a small accusing moon. Her hands were steadier now. She wrapped the tin in a rag and tucked it under her dress. The house was soundless around her. Every footstep felt catalogued by the walls. She walked into the night toward the lane where the trees made a dark fence. The moon was thin and obedient. The air bit her cheeks, and the world outside the estate felt like the edge of permission. She had no certainty of safety. She had only the quiet conviction that Leon's name had been handed back to her to defend. She had the diary in her chest, and a tin of powder concealed against her body. The stage on which her life had been relocated had become a room of dangers she could not ignore. As she stepped into the dark, Clara felt the old life fall from her like a garment. The telegram had taken something from her the moment it arrived. In leaving the house, she was choosing what to become in the space that remained. The choice would not reconvey the life she had lost. There would be no reversal. But in the grim arithmetic of that loss, she found a new sum, the children's future and her own agency, not as a commodity, but as the right to decide. Behind her, the windows of the house shone with lamplight, small rectangles of golden warning. Ahead, the lane swallowed the light. She moved with a determination that was not reckless but purposeful. The tin at her waist was heavy, an anchor in a sea she intended to chart. She had not yet imagined how men like Gideon Price would attempt to discredit a grieving woman, or how Crowley's anger might make the company of his allies a thing to fear. She had not guessed how cold the world could turn when money was threatened. but she knew one thing with the peculiar clarity that only grief can give. There was no going back to the life where she could pretend she had been consulted on the swapping of sisters-like things. That day had already marked her irrevocably. The only question left was what she would make of the mark. She had the tin wrapped against her body like contraband, and the diary pressed to her ribs as if the two together might be heavier than the house's power. The lane swallowed her, and for a long moment the trees were only wind and shadow. Footsteps came soft behind her. Another silhouette cut the thin night, and her heart leapt with a hope she would not name. Cole Mercer had not been a steward of promises. He had been a presence that altered what the day offered. He stood in the moonlight when she turned, hands empty, face a map of open weather. He had not come like a savior. He had come like a neighbor who knew the shape of trouble and preferred to move through it without spectacle. "You shouldn't be out here," he said. His voice held no accusation. It held a practicality fitted to danger. Clara did not tell him everything. She had learned the economy of truth in a house that priced silence. But she let him see the tin, the way her hand curled around the rag. He did not take it like a man stealing treasure. He took it like a man accepting an entrusted thing. "You need a place," he said, and when she hesitated he added, "There's a widow, Mrs. Dalton. She minds what she takes in. Quiet, earners of the truth. I know the road without eyes." They moved with the small efficiency of people who have both lived with storms and learned how to keep the shutters latched. The cold lunged at them when they hurried from cover. Their breath came as puffs of white that flared and vanished. Only once, when a lantern bobbed at the edge of the lane, a stable hand on late duty, they crouched into the black and let the passing figure go on. Clara felt like a conspirator in her own life, and the feeling made her limbs both lighter and strangely more measured. Mrs. Dalton's little house smelled of yeast and lavender. The widow herself was all elbows and kindness, a woman who had kept the town's secrets folded like aprons in her life. She took the children with a grandmother's surety, fussing over their cold hands and offering them porridge with the kind of question that asked nothing sharp in return. She listened to Clara with a care that was almost religious in its precision. "You did right," Mrs. Dalton said when Clara set the wrapped tin and the diary on the table beneath a lamp. "You don't send those things to the river." Her voice carried no theatre. "If what you say is true, the law might listen if it has reason to open its ears." Cole found the sheriff that night. He had the sort of acquaintances men like him gather in a life of working in the pines. He did not deliver Clara like a parcel, but as one might present a witness, carefully, with an explanation of the danger and without hype. The sheriff was a broad-shouldered man who smelled faintly of tobacco and rope. He read the diary with a face that altered from polite curiosity to a gravity practiced in councils with the living and the dead. "We can move on suspicion if there's probable cause," he said. "A good paper, a man's reputation, and a chemist's hand, likely to be enough to get a warrant." He tapped the tin with a single finger, as if testing whether the object would break under the pressure of his certainty. "We'll send a sample to the county seat, but I'll want more than words. If there's anything else, we get it tonight." The house, the sheriff knew, could not be approached recklessly. Crowley's power was not only in watches and silver. It was in the way people bent when his name passed through a room. He had men who attended to his needs, and a lawyer who could turn civic process into a silk thread and tangle it around witnesses. That was the ledger Clara had learned to read, but it was also true that a man who had hands in too many pockets left things in too many places. The sheriff went outward with a warrant the next morning, not with a cavalry, but with the authority of law and the practical care of a man who understood that force without papers was lawless and would be dismissed. The search of the study was quiet, because the law allows for quiet when it is done with right. Papers were rifled, drawers laid open, and finally, beneath receipts and old letters, a tin of the same make as the one in Clara's possession was lifted like a mirror. The sheriff did not announce triumph. He only put his hat back on and looked up. There were other things, notes from the doctor, a small ledger of questionable purchases, and a bottle with residues that the county chemist would one day name later in a way that had teeth. Crowley's face when he learned of the intrusion was a study in slow, contained rage. He moved through it like a cold current, reminding people in polite phrases that reputations were files to be kept clean. Gideon Price stepped into the hush like a man whose profession was smoothing furrows for the rich. He spoke of overreach and rumor, of how a man's name could be ruined on scraps of women's handwriting. He offered money in small and larger ways. He offered counsel. He offered veiled threats that modern people might have called bribes, and others accepted as merely the cost of doing business. But medicine and paper refused to bow to money. The county chemist, a man in spectacles, reported the presence of arsenic in the powder. The doctor's receipts, when cross-checked, failed to explain certain purchases. Mrs. Bell, when the sheriff took the courage to speak to her without Crowley's men in the room, told what she had kept like a candle in a cupboard. Missing small jars, a night when Leon had grown paler, the way the doctor's visits ended with a package taken away. Her voice came soft and then harder, as if she had been saving it for a day she thought might never arrive. Crowley could not shout a man-sized lie over the weight of a vial and a woman's diary. He could try. He tried with finesse. He brought forward people who spoke of the family's good name. He whispered to shopkeepers. He offered the town jobs and favors. But in the end, the law moves on concrete things. Powder, paper, witness. It moves with a jury if the evidence is seen to be established. The sheriff felt, with that slow professional certainty, that an indictment could be had. Still, an indictment is not conviction. The hearing at the town's small courthouse felt like a theater in which every face carried their ledger of loyalties. The gallery was full of people who had known the Crowleys longer than they had known each other. Crowley arrived with the air of a man who expected a room to yield to his presence. He did not shout. He did not need to. His lawyer, someone who smelled of oiled cuffs and cool calculation, cracked open the case with soft-spoken questions designed to tug at the jury's tendency to trust a man who had paid their bills. Gideon Price sat in the back, offering counsel like a shadow. Clara felt, when she sat in that courtroom, the full weight of the day she had received the telegram. Her life had been moved as if arranged on a chessboard. Now she was in the middle of the game, not as a pawn, but as a player who had learned a few of the moves. She held the diary in a small portfolio and had brought with her the thin strip of paper containing Leon's last notes. She would not be theatrically brave. She would be deliberate. Mrs. Bell's testimony was careful but devastating in its ordinariness. She spoke of missing jars, of odd doctor visits, of small remedies that seemed to come and go. The sheriff presented the chemist's report with the flat teaching voice of someone who had seen too much sorrow for his liking. The powder from the sugar jar and the powder from the tin were the same by the chemist's test. There was now a physical link that could be pointed to in a way that rumor never could. Gideon Price moved to the attack the way a man who lives in polite rooms does when things smell of danger. He sought to discredit Mrs. Bell with questions about whether she had the motive to lie, wages owed, a grudge, a jealous heart. He tried to make the diary seem like a private grievance. "Who else could have written these things?" he asked, leaning forward to make his voice low, as if a half-truth might invite the jury to clothe it in doubt. Then they called the children. The courtroom's air shifted when Oven came forward. He stood small but steady at the clerk's table, his fingers worrying a corner of his sleeve. The lawyer's voice gentled, so perhaps the defense hoped to coax a misstep. But the child's memory was not a thing easily coached. "He gave my mama tea," Oven said plainly. She drank, and then she lay down and she was sore. His voice was younger than the graveyard had made him, but in its simplicity there was an accuracy that no lawyer's flourish could deny. Millie, with a ribbon still clinging to her braid, spoke in a voice that trembled at first, and then found the curve of truth. "The sugar smelled like pennies once," she said, and the room leaned in as if a child's phrase could carry a verdict. Clara felt something in her loosen. The small cathedral of the court had listened to two small people say what had happened in the smallest terms. Cross-examination came as the defense tried the gentle knives. Did the children's mother complain before? Had they been coached? But the children's words sat like nails. They were children, not actors. Their recollections had the brittle clarity of memory unburdened by adult calculations. A juror's glance tracked between the diary's slanted lines and the powdered residue on the chemist's paper. It is possible in courts for a case to convert into a moral arithmetic where paper and child combine to outweigh gold. The turning point, Clara thought later, was not a single dramatic moment, but a series of small methodical reckonings. The chemist's calm report, Mrs. Bell's ordinary dignity, the children's simple phrases. Crowley's allies pushed furiously, the town's whispers, Gideon Price's legalese. But the town's ears had begun to hear a different music. When the verdict came, it was not accompanied by thunder, but by a certain amazed quiet. The jury found Adorat Crowley guilty of poisoning his wife. They did not shout. They signed papers marking his fate and left the law to do what it must. Crowley's face remained composed as he was taken away. He had always believed a man of his stature could withstand small storms. The law, however slow and errant at times, had found metal enough in the evidence to withhold his freedom. Clara watched him go and felt a mixture of relief and an anchor of sorrow. Conviction did not bring Leon back. It did not unmake the ledger that had put her there to begin with. It did, however, remove a presence that had been an immediate danger to the children and to anyone who might have the misfortune of being close to him. In that, there was a kind of cold justice that made room for something like safety. After the trial, the town's machinery turned to other things, as towns do, but not everything returned to its old pattern. Expenses were tended, the estate was placed in trust for the children's care, while the courts sorted the dispersal of assets. Clara found herself, with papers and small official gestures, named as the children's legal guardian. The appointment shocked no one who knew the ledger of human relationships, and yet surprised many who had imagined power would simply pick a man to hold the role. That the guardian would be a woman who had arrived on a telegram seemed to confer both irony and justice. Clara did not accept the guardianship as a favor. She accepted it because she had been given the most intimate knowledge of Leon's care, and because in the ledger of culpability, she had become the one who could protect the children from rumors and from the bureaucracy that might, in a hurry, erase them. The town murmured, some with approval, some with disdain. But there was a steadiness to the appointment that felt like an answer to the smallest prayers. Life after the trial was not a sudden unfolding of joyful ribbons. There were debts and claims and the practicalities of ensuring the children had milk and shoes and an education. There were nights when Clara woke to the old pulse of grief, but she was no longer moved like a parcel from one man's office to another. She had been put in place by force, yes, but the place she had made for herself there was chosen work. Cole did not appear in a single heroic return. He steadied like a presence who pays his care in small increments. He came with a repaired boot for oven and an extra length of rope for the yard. He brought one afternoon a thin volume of frontier poems he had swiped from a traveling peddler, and he read to Millie in a voice that did not demand anything from anyone. When Clara was overwhelmed with legal forms, he sat with the children and taught Oven to carve with a pocket knife until the boy's hands learned a different kind of patience. They built a life not on proclamations but on repetitive kindness. Cole's steady practical help, mending a fence, fixing a broken harness, teaching the children to hold a horse, and Clara's more domestic ministrations, letters home, a ledger of school lessons, the careful preservation of Leon's small ornaments. Love threaded itself through those minutes like a careful seam, not flashy, not rushed, but persistent. There were evenings when they sat under blankets on the porch and looked at the sky. Cole was not a man given to speeches. When he spoke of the future, it was in the language of things he could do. "If you ever want to leave this town and go somewhere with less memory," he said once, "I have a little place. Not a house of marble, no, just a ranch. Ground that needs hands and people who will show up to hold it together. You don't have to answer me now." Clara did not make a promise. She did not need to. A month later, when the paperwork had been done and the weight of the estate had been put in order so the children could be safe, she walked through a small house on a piece of land Cole had shown her. It had small rooms and a hearth that refused to stand silent. She thought of Leon and of the telegram that had begun this conspiracy of choices. She thought of ovens and ribbons and of the way a house's things could be used as instruments of harm or of hearth. Here, perhaps, she could show the children a different set of uses. When she finally chose, it was the decision of someone who had learned that freedom can come in the form of duties accepted. She chose to take the children to the ranch. She would not say that she was rescued. She was not. She was choosing. The difference mattered to her, like the difference between night and dawn. The move was small and human. Oven grinned at the new chores, delighted with a calf that needed to be coaxed into a stall. Millie claimed a corner by the window and insisted Clara read the same story until the words stained her memory. Mrs. Dalton kissed their brows and said blessings in a voice that was more prayer than remark. Cole arrived with boxes and tools and a steady hand that made the heavy lifting lighter. They created domestic rhythms that had nothing to do with the ledger the town had once kept. There were mornings of eggs and amber light, afternoons when the children chased after a dog with too much eagerness, and nights when Clara would sit by the hearth and write letters to no one in particular. It was not uncomplicated peace. There were still days when Leon's absence sat like a room without light, but the children laughed more than they had in months, and Clara had the satisfaction of being the arbiter of their small, ordinary joys. Cole's affection came as a series of choices rather than a single declaration. He learned to fix the stove so the children could warm their hands. He took Millie to fetch water and let her pick wildflowers on the way back. He sat up once through a feverish night with Oven and did not ask for rewards. Clara watched him with a caution that had the sharpness of someone who had learned to read men's offers for what they were. He never demanded that she exchange grief for a ring. He offered presents day after day, and that steadied whatever fragile thing was growing between them. At some point, when the children were asleep and the lantern fizzed low, Cole put his hand lightly at the small of her back while they stood on the porch and watched the stars come out. He did not speak of marriage or contracts. He spoke of planting a row of trees and of the slow goodness of watching things take root. "You can go back if you want," he said once in a moment of cruel honesty. "There's no law that says your life must be what it was, but if you stay, I'll be here. No fiddling with ledgers, no buying of favors, just a place to keep what is yours." Clara thought of the telegram folded like an accusation, of the day she had realized her life no longer belonged to her. The truth of that realization remained. There had been an irreversible theft, an old life closed like a door with no key. But in that same breath she felt the careful, stubborn flowering of something else, a life she was choosing to build, hard and precise as a fence. The two things could live in the same chest, loss and the decision born of it. She turned from the sky and leaned into him, as if into a shelter that had to be earned. "I won't be moved again," she said. It was not a vow of ownership, but of resolve. Not like that. In the months that followed, they learned the choreography of survival and small luxury. There were harvests that yielded better bread than they had hoped. There were winters that tested them, and they met them with wood stacked high, and neighbors who returned favors when the need arose. The children's laughter threaded through the rooms like a stubborn melody. Leon's memory was kept alive in small acts. Millie's insistence on the same 2 stories. Oven's carving that mirrored an old pattern his mother had taught him. The way they named the small corner by the hearth Leon had liked, as if it were a shrine that needed no priest. Clara often found herself awake in the night, watching the children sleep in a single room, listening to the small tenacity of their breath. It occurred to her then how fragile possession had once felt when the town moved her like a commodity. Now she held custody not as a right given by men, but as a duty chosen and guarded. She had learned to measure power not by gold, but by the steadiness of hands who returned when help was needed. In the quiet hours on the ranch's back porch, she sometimes said the sentence aloud that had been the hinge of everything. That day, Clara realized her life no longer belonged to her, and there was no way back. The line no longer landed like an accusation, but like a fact whose shape she had accepted. The phrase folded into the present and reframed it. There was no way back, and there was also, crucially, the work of moving forward. She would not be able to recuperate what had been taken. That truth never left her. But she guarded something else now. Leon's children, their name, the small daily kindnesses that stitched a life together. In that guarding there was an autonomy that felt like a kind of victory. Cole's steady company, the children's small hands, Mrs. Dalton's continuing visits, and the soft respect of people who had watched events and learned to speak differently, all of it formed the architecture of a new home. One clear night, when the wood stove had settled down to an ember, and the children slept in the next room with a dog curled at their feet, Clara and Cole sat on the porch. The sky was a smear of stars, indifferent and crowded. Cole handed her a cup of tea. She thought of the sugar jar and the way ordinary objects had been turned into instruments of danger. She laughed, a small sound that startled only her, and said, "I'll be careful with sugar here." Cole smiled in a way that asked for nothing dramatic. "I'll be careful to bring the kettle," he said, "and to hold the lid if you need me to." They did not promise each other forever in words. They did not need to. Instead, they made a dozen small promises with their hands and their mornings. Feed the chickens, mend the fence, read the story twice, teach Oven to measure wood without burning his thumb. Those marginal acts of constancy were the mortar. Clara had been moved once by a family's ledger. The move had been an awful mechanical thing that had taken her into a life neither chosen nor asked for. That movement marked her with a truth that would not be erased. Yet the irrevocability contained in that original sentence came to share space with something else. The freedom to choose, at last, what to protect and how. Her life no longer belonged to the plans of men who counted profit over love. It belonged to the children who needed a hand to tuck them in. It belonged to the small days of repair and laughter, and the steady, patient presence of a man who had taught himself to wait without asking her to be grateful. It belonged to the hard work of building a household where measures were taken by care. On the porch that night, as a cold wind passed through the grass and the stars kept their slow counsel, Clara rested her head on Cole's shoulder and watched Oven's small silhouette move in the slit of lamplight through the window. The decision she had made, first to gather evidence and risk everything, then to accept guardianship, and finally to step into a chosen life, felt like a string of small lights leading out of a dark room. She whispered the sentence once more, not as a doom but as a witness. That day, I realized my life no longer belonged to me, and there was no way back. She smiled because she had found a way forward that was not given but earned. If this story touched you, consider exploring more true-feeling Western dramas on this channel, stories of quiet courage and the small acts that change lives.